Richard Perle, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. Mr. Perle was involved in the two earlier meetings between President Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev, and he joins us now to talk about the Soviets' negotiating style and the behind-the-scenes dynamics of summit meetings.
Richard Perle, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy and one who's observed superpower summit negotiations firsthand. How do you think the Soviets are approaching this summit meeting in terms of their negotiating strategy?
The way they approach every summit meeting, with a view to extracting whatever they can in the way of concessions from the United States.
The deal has pretty much been inked, yet they're coming in, they're going to have a summit. What is there to negotiate?
Well, the Soviets are interested in far more than the elimination of intermediate nuclear missiles. In fact, in my view, they are paying the price of eliminating intermediate nuclear missiles in order to get at the other things that are more important to them. The highest priority for them is killing off the American Strategic Defense Initiative. That's been the center of their negotiating strategy. And I believe that they're going along with eliminating intermediate nuclear forces in order to keep the process of negotiation alive so that they can have a shot at the SDI program.
In terms of actually what will happen on Monday, the General Secretary arrives, there's going to be a signing of the already agreed to treaty. Then what's on the table?
Well, there are 5 sessions scheduled, substantive discussions between the President and the General Secretary. And I imagine they will cover the full range of issues that we've discussed at previous summits, not only arms control, although unfortunately arms control tends to dominate these deliberations. But they'll talk about regional issues, they'll talk about human rights almost certainly, and a variety of bilateral questions.
What do you expect to come out of this summit?
An agreement on intermediate nuclear forces that will eliminate them.
Anything on those other 5 issues?
Well, we haven't had much in the way of results before on the regional issues. At virtually every summit thus far, there's been talk about Afghanistan, but the Soviet troops are still there. There's been discussion of Southeast Asia, but they are still supporting war and turbulence in that part of the world. There's been discussion about Africa, and through their Cuban proxies, they continue to operate in Angola and in the Horn of Africa. So we haven't made much progress on the regional issues. On bilateral issues, we're moving toward an array of agreements, cooperative programs in all sorts of areas. We've concluded one already with respect to space cooperation. Others are under discussion having to do with housing and transportation and maritime affairs, and science and technology, and a variety of other things. And here I think the process is just careening wildly out of control. Every agency in Washington is scrambling to put together a cooperative program, whether it makes any sense or not. Most of them don't.
Let's talk about the process itself. Is there any value in getting President Reagan, a principal, in the same room with General Secretary Gorbachev, a principal? Does any work get done, or is it somewhere else that the work gets done?
No, work can get done at that level, and where there are issues that can be resolved by a say-so from one or the other, it's in theory at least possible that something could be done.
What have you found to be the truth in practice?
Well, I think the previous summits were important in conveying the ideas that each had about the issues that were on the table. For example, at the Geneva summit in 1985, and then again at the Reykjavik summit in 1986, President Reagan made it pretty clear to General Secretary Gorbachev that he wasn't going to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative. In order to carry forward these negotiations, Gorbachev has to understand what the scope for a possible agreement is, and I think the President has made it clear. It was necessary to make it clear first in Geneva and then to repeat it in Reykjavik for the Russians to get the message. I'm not sure they've got it yet.
I guess negotiating is more of an art than a science, and I wonder how all of those nuances in face-to-face negotiations are affected by the presence of an interpreter, especially between the two principals.
Well, clearly the fact that it is not a direct discussion, but everything is said through an intermediary, there are questions of tone of voice and expression and so forth, diminishes somewhat the ability to communicate.
Is there, I don't know if I've heard it discussed before, but is it possible that one side can take advantage or exploit that, that fact that there's an interpreter in the room to its advantage over the other?
Not as between the President and Gorbachev. So it has been our experience negotiating with Russians at other levels, I've had this experience myself, that your Russian counterpart, even if he speaks flawless English, will use his interpreter. Now this means that he hears you speak and present your side. He understands exactly what you're saying. Then the interpreter speaks. During the time that the interpreter is speaking, he can be formulating his response. So he has twice as long to prepare a response as you have, since you've got to listen to the translation in order to understand what's being said.
Can you characterize Gorbachev's style of negotiating?
Well, he's very tough. There is something inherent, I believe, in the Soviet style generally, and Gorbachev is no exception here, and that is they frequently either say or imply that unless they get their way on one point or another, the negotiation's over, or it's going to be suspended. You may recall that in the days before the summit, which begins on Monday, the visit to Moscow that Secretary Shultz made, there was some question about whether there would be a summit, even at that late date. That was the Soviets trying, through their old tactics, to intimidate our side into making concessions. In 1985, in January, when Secretary Shultz went to meet with then Foreign Minister Gromyko in order to restart the arms control negotiations that the Soviets had walked out of in December of 1983, Gromyko at one point said, if you can't go along with our views, then we'll just have to end this meeting without a result. So they do that all the time. And of course, Gorbachev at Reykjavik said there will be no agreement on intermediate missiles unless you agree to something on SDI. In every case, they backed down. These ploys didn't work, but they're always trying.
In the room, when the principals are talking to each other, is there some technique that they're more likely to use in making these implications of no deal unless we get our way?
Sometimes they can be pretty direct about it. And they try to exploit the fact that our leaders have to answer to a voting public. And they do not have to appeal to a voting public because there is none. Gorbachev is largely free, together with his colleagues, to do what he wishes to do, and there won't be nasty editorials in the New York Times or the Washington Post.
How much, is there a difference between the Americans and the Soviets to the extent to which the principals rely on their staff, such as frequently the General Secretary turning over an item to someone sitting alongside of him? Does that happen?
When the President and the General Secretary are together, frequently they are alone, or just with their respective Secretaries of State. So it doesn't happen in that case. But I think any head of state relies significantly on staff, if not in the meetings themselves, in preparing for them, because these issues are enormously complex. And indeed, many of the issues are too complex to be dealt with by heads of state. They can deal in broad principles, but when you get down to defining what it takes in order to verify compliance with an arms control treaty, that's beyond really the scope of most heads of state.
Well, then let's talk some more about the staff. At Reykjavik, we were reading the news stories about how the staff worked literally overnight. Who are those people, and what does it mean to say that they're working overnight? Are they actually working through the night?
Oh, we sat through the night negotiating. Paul Nitze led the American delegation. Marshal Akrameyev led the Soviet delegation. And there were 6 or 7 of us on each side. And we spent the whole night going back and forth, point by point, trying to narrow differences and agree upon language, if we could, that would form the basis for eventual treaties. And we made some progress that night. Not enough, but some.
Is that going to happen this time?
Probably.
Who will be the principals on behalf of the United States?
Well, it will depend in this case on whether the INF Treaty is signed, sealed, and delivered. That is, whether everything has been agreed or whether there are still some remaining issues.
Do you believe that it's signed, sealed, and delivered?
I never believe it's signed, sealed, and delivered until it is signed and delivered. The Russians have a way of agreeing across the table, and then when you go to formulate the precise words, you suddenly discover there were problems you didn't know you had.
So you believe there's still a possibility that there might not be a simple signing on schedule?
Oh, I think there will be a signing, but prior to the signing, there may be a last-minute scramble to cope with some unresolved issues. That happened at the Nixon-Kissinger summit in Moscow in 1972. It's not uncommon.
You mentioned Marshal Akhmayev, is that right?
Yes.
He has a rather highly respected reputation among American negotiators, if you read the press. What does he owe that to?
Well, some of the Soviet negotiators are so endlessly repetitive and boring and heavy-handed and inefficient in the way that Russians are inefficient. Sometimes you go through months when they simply don't want to negotiate, but instead of saying, let's knock it off for a few months and come back when we're ready to negotiate, they go through the motions and they can just drive you up the wall. Akhmayev has only appeared briefly at the Reykjavik summit and then the other day in Moscow. Sort of cameo appearances, if you will, and as a marshal of the Soviet Union, he exhibits considerable authority. So he can move more decisively than the typical Soviet negotiators. But if we saw as much of Akhmayev as we've seen of Karpov and some of the others, we might begin to feel the same way about him, too.
Is Akhmayev scheduled to be here?
I believe he will come, yes.
Is that a signal as to how the Soviets intend to negotiate?
It is, among other things, an indication that Gorbachev wishes to express the support of the military for what he is doing here.
I realize you've been party to some of these negotiations, but maybe you can step back and give a judgment as to how you think the Americans are as negotiators with the Soviets. Are we good?
Not always.
What makes
and
us...
sometimes we've been quite bad.
When?
Well, I think we got a lot of crucial details wrong in the SALT I agreement. We repeated that performance in the SALT II agreement. We frequently make concessions that we don't need to make because we tend to underestimate the Soviet capacity to be moved through the course of the negotiating process.
What does the effect of a desire to have an agreement have on a negotiation?
Well, it's deadly if it's only on one side, or if it's on one side more than on the other side. When we become eager for an agreement, the Soviets capitalize on that, and they start settling outstanding issues their way.
Do you think that happened in this agreement?
I think it always happens to some extent, and I haven't seen the results of the last 3 weeks or so of negotiation, but I'm concerned about some of the things that might have been resolved less favorably than could otherwise have been the case if we had shown the kind of detachment that I think would have been appropriate in this situation.
Do you think a democratic country like ours could ever be as tough just because of the democratic impulse you talked about as the Soviets?
Unlikely.
And is there any way that the United States could ever be as tough, given the democracy, as the Soviets are?
Well, we're not, by our nature, tough. We don't like large standing armies or military establishments. We're suspicious of them. We dismantled the army we had after World War II and again after Korea. The Soviet military tradition is quite different from ours. They believe in military power in a way that we don't. I think we consider military power an unhappy necessity, sometimes forced on us by the state of affairs in the world, but not something that we prize or value for any other reason. That isn't true in the Soviet case. Their attitude toward military power is that it affects political relations, and they want it in the largest quantities they can get.
To what extent do the Soviets try to bring in the negotiations our relationship with our NATO allies?
They always have, as one of their objectives, splitting the United States from its allies, either by trying to engineer proposals that will give the appearance that we're backing out on our allies or diminishing our support for them. And there was a great flurry of activity a few weeks ago having to do with the disposition of some old German Pershing missiles as a consequence of this agreement. 99% of that issue represented an effort by the Soviets to create a split between the U.S. and Germany. Those weapons were of no great significance militarily, and the Russians knew it. So they are always trying to raise in the minds of our European allies doubts and reservations about whether the United States can be counted upon in a crisis or over the long term to come to the support of our allies.
How do you think that the United States need to stay in constant touch with the allies on some of these summit negotiations affects our ability to be tough bargainers?
Well, there are times when our allies drive us crazy, urging us to make concessions here and concessions there, either because they've got some local election coming up or because some expert in their foreign ministry has a bright idea. And when you negotiate as the leader of an alliance, but an alliance of pretty independent countries, you have to take everyone's view into account, and that means that your policy is only as strong as the weakest member. And I think the Soviets obviously benefit from not having real allies in the sense in which we have them. They decide what the policy is, and the Hungarians and the Poles and others do not object. So that's another advantage that they have in negotiations with us.
How do you characterize your negotiating style?
I think it's important talking to the Russians to be very plain, very clear. I don't think we help either them or our own cause when we wrap everything up in a diplomatic fog. It runs a considerable risk of misunderstanding and potentially even dangerous misunderstanding. But more to the point, I think the Russians want to know where they stand. They want someone who will tell them what the bottom line is. Too frequently, we've led them to believe that maybe we could be moved.
Are you willing to offer a judgment as to who has been the best American negotiator with the Soviets in recent years?
That's hard to say.
Would you be willing to offer some advice to the negotiators who will be meeting with the Soviets when they arrive tomorrow?
I always have the same advice in situations like this, and that is you must know and remind yourself minute by minute what your objective is, because it is very easy to slide into a pattern.
Go ahead.
It is very easy to slide into a pattern of losing sight of your objective, in which case you wind up negotiating a treaty just for the sake of having an agreement. So,
and that pressure is could still be felt by the American negotiators, you believe?
Oh, absolutely. It's an ever-present danger. And the negotiations that have gone badly in the past have gone badly principally because at some point along the way, getting an agreement became more important to us than realizing the underlying objectives that led us to negotiate in the first place.
What role does the American media play in these summit negotiations?
They don't make it easier. Things are put in terms of who's winning and who's losing. That doesn't help. I think that tends to cause positions to harden on both sides. They expect immediate results, and they create a sense of immediacy. The live event is taking place, and by the end of the program, we want to know how it came out.
Do you believe that, or what, if you had your druthers, how would you have the press behave on the eve and during the course of a summit?
Well, one's druthers here are really irrelevant. These are events of very considerable interest, and the press will flock to them and cover them live, and programs will be anchored out of the mall in Washington tomorrow and for the next few days. There's no way that one could hope to dampen that sort of coverage, but it does acquire rather easily an over-dramatization. It is not necessary, simply because the leaders meet, that something significant fall out of that. Sometimes it's useful to meet just to understand better where we differ. But the attention, the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 reporters waiting for results adds significantly, I think, to the pressure that the leaders are under.
And finally, this will be a summit that you're not directly involved in. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's a lot to be said for not staying up all night. I won't mind that. I hope that the President will conduct this summit as he conducted the summit in Geneva and the summit in Reykjavik. That is, he had a clear idea of what his objectives were, he stuck to them, and he got good results.
Richard Perle, thanks for talking with us about negotiations.
Thank you.
C-SPAN's preview of the summit meeting